125 million people need daily assistance. 60 million people have become displaced or refugees. The level of international support has been much less than needed.
Hello and welcome to the special edition of the Newsmakers. I'm Imran Garta. We're here at the World Humanitarian Summit. It's the first of its kind. World leaders and NGOs are trying to tackle what the UN describes as the world's worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. They're trying to figure out how to manage and deliver aid differently. But will they be able to provide solutions, real solutions, to the estimated 125 million people who desperately need the aid? We begin with this report from Yvette McCullough.
It's been described as a mega crisis.
The level of suffering in the world continues to outpace the funding we need.
The most extreme humanitarian need in history.
To prevent the suffering around the world, we should ensure that current conflicts are ended.
The devastating effects of ongoing conflicts, extreme poverty, and environmental disasters are deepening.
Today, the urgency has grown.
More than 60 million people are displaced worldwide. Wars raging in places like Syria, Yemen, and South Sudan have created an unprecedented refugee crisis, overwhelming regional neighbours in Western Europe. And while the world is giving more aid than ever before, it's still falling drastically short. The United Nations estimates 125 million people are in need of humanitarian aid. A record $25 billion is being spent on aid each year, but that falls short by $15 billion. And as needs continue to rise dramatically, so too does the deficit. The World Humanitarian Summit wants to revamp, re-inspire and reinvigorate the aid system. The UN says this won't be just another pledging conference, and real decisions will be made. But the community is divided on how to actually achieve that, and there's concern that the summit and its commitments are non-binding. Major NGO Médecins Sans Frontières is boycotting the summit. 75 of the hospitals it managed or supported in conflict zones were bombed last year. It's described the summit as a fig leaf of good intentions. And it says states face obligations under humanitarian law, and by putting them on the same level as NGOs and UN agencies, their responsibilities are minimised. For millions around the world, the need for humanitarian aid has never been greater or more urgent. And as impacts of conflicts, climate change and poverty continue to increase, will global leaders be able to step up to the task of finding a meaningful solution? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is the UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Stephen O'Brien. Thank you very much for joining us, sir.
My pleasure.
MSF, Doctors Without Borders, they pulled out. They're boycotting. They've said this is a fig leaf of good intentions. How damaging has that been to the World Humanitarian Summit?
Not in the slightest damaging. This is anything but a fig leaf. This is nearly 6,000 people coming, 175 countries and 60 at head of state, head of government level, with all the NGOs, INGOs and others who give humanitarian action to people in the most desperate need, coming to make sure that we can do it both better and to reach the scale necessary for the escalating humanitarian needs around the world. And we have managed to pull together all the core ideas that are going to give us the chance to commit to the action that will take us forward in a way that will help to meet those needs of the most desperate people in the world who are left in vulnerability through no fault of their own.
The New York Times says this summit will have thin influence. Foreign Policy had a headline saying this is a total mess. Why are they wrong?
They're wrong because the commitments to action, which will be about 1,000, which we will put together. These will be the collective commitments of countries, of all those who are practitioners in delivering life-saving protection of innocent civilians, giving people hope, the chance to thrive in the future. And all that will come together as a result of the meeting of those who are the experts in doing this. And that's why you need to garner the political will that will make sure we can propel this forward, going forward, and deliver this both through us all doing better, plus the member states who are at the end, the donor agencies who produce the bulk of the money.
How do you garner the political will when none of it can be binding?
Well, that's the whole point, is if it was just a pledging conference, we'd count the money and everybody would move on. This is to get the political will that absolutely propels people to feel committed, and we will expect everybody who makes commitments to then be the champions of those commitments in making sure we deliver that in a concrete way going forward. Look, we have no choice. The escalating amount of humanitarian need out of natural hazard because of climate and climate change related hazard affecting millions of people all over the world, and because of protracted crisis coming out of conflict, man-made conflict, and the failure of politics to be able to put those conflicts right and to resolve them, that leads to many people suffering, either through lives lost which can be saved or to protect civilians. We have no choice given the amount of need, and despite a generous world, that not being enough to meet those needs. And unless we do something which is going to make that gap filled by doing it better, we are not doing our duty. So we must do this. Otherwise, we are going to let people who could be saved not have that chance.
Are you disappointed that some of those big hitters, those big decision makers are not here?
Well, Angela Merkel is coming, and we do have 175 member states out of the 190 or so in the world coming. So that is pretty good for the Turkish hosts as well as for all of us involved in the Humanitarian Summit. And it's therefore, let's remember, a World Humanitarian Summit. It is not just a meeting of the traditional donors with the UN system. Far from it. It's an engagement of all hemispheres, all countries, all peoples represented, together with all those who deliver humanitarian effects. So no, I'm not disappointed. I'm deeply encouraged and enthused by the level of support. And over 60 heads of government, heads of state, coming to a conference over 2 days like this, where it is to make sure that we discuss at the most principled level one of the most moral imperatives of our time, and at the same time to deliver concrete, practical results which are going to make the most massive difference to the people who are most vulnerable and in need. I'm in no doubt that if you're a child who has not received an education because you've been displaced by conflict, you will see the result of us announcing a new Education in Emergencies fund and program in an event which would not have otherwise catalysed and happened had we not had this conference. So there's a concrete result for the many children who will benefit.
Some of the best estimates say that more than $25 billion is spent annually worldwide to fix the humanitarian problem. So there isn't really a shortage of money. Why doesn't the money get to the people who need it most? Where is it critically broken?
Well, I think actually where you're wrong is actually there is a shortage of money. The estimate of need that cannot be met at the moment with the amount of money which is actually donated and turns from pledges to cash to buy programs to save lives and protect civilians, that is about, on many estimates, about $15 billion short. That represents many lives lost who could otherwise be saved. And so you hint at the idea this is diverted. Of course, in any organisation, as we know, there is occasional diversion, but let's not get this out of proportion. The money reaches people who need it, and we have lives saved, and we are going to build on the best and to make sure we undertake the changes necessary to meet the needs of the future.
You mentioned the need to be impartial and independent. Let me ask you about Syria. At what point do you have to say, hey, we can't be impartial anymore here. We have to actively criticize the Assad regime because you're starving your people to death and we're not going to stand for it?
No, I'm not playing any games. The lives at risk are too important for such an idea. It's absolutely imperative that we, as the United Nations, have the opportunity to speak to all. Passing a resolution is important, but it doesn't save a life. What does save a life is having very brave people on the ground, as we do in Syria, whether it's in Damascus or elsewhere, talking to the Syrian government to get past the checkpoints. You can have a 30-truck convoy. You have to negotiate with the first 8. They're the Syrian government ones. You then negotiate with the next 3. They're Hezbollah. They're waiting for a phone call from Tehran to let you through. You then negotiate with the next 6, which are from the militia within the town, of the people who are representing the besieged people, who say, no, we don't want it in until you actually agree to take people out to evacuate them for medical treatment, and they will actually deny you going in until you get that agreement. You often can't, because where do you take them in safety? And I can't allow the truck drivers of the convoys to set going if there's a sniper who's waiting to shoot them because we haven't secured an agreement by the very brave people who let us in. That's impartiality, that's neutrality, that's independence, and that's real life saving, instead of getting to all these political games. And let's be clear, there is no humanitarian solution to humanitarian problems. There are only political solutions to humanitarian problems.
So let me then end this by asking, should you be putting more pressure on the politicians?
We put pressure on every day. My monthly reports to the Security Council absolutely say exactly what's going on. I rely upon the facts and I put the pressure on the politicians, but they have to do the politics. They have to find the negotiating way forward. And let's be clear, there are talks which have been taking place in Geneva. We hope that these are going to produce the real results. We have a cessation of hostilities, which has been producing a much better environment by which we, the impartial humanitarians, can, in all our combinations of people both in the UN and those outside, such as the ICRC, such as the Syrian Arab Red Crescent societies, and are reaching people who've not been reached, whether in some cases for 4 years. This is real progress, but it is still by no means sufficient.
Stephen O'Brien, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, joining me now is Melissa Fleming, Chief Communications and Spokesperson for UNHCR. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
Let's go back to basics for a second. What's a refugee and what's a migrant?
I am so glad you asked that question because it's getting so conflated in the politics that are happening right now. There is a distinction and there's an important difference. A refugee is also on the move, just like a migrant, but the difference is a refugee cannot return to his or her country. If he or she would be returned, that person would face life-threatening danger. So that's the difference, and there is an international convention, the 1951 Refugee Convention, that protects refugees, allows them to seek asylum. Migrants are generally fleeing for economic reasons. Not to say that these aren't very compelling as well, but the difference is they could go home.
Now, there are many, particularly on the right in Europe right now, who are not keen on what they perceive as a flood of refugees across, or migrants. And they call them migrants, and they say, hold on, their last point of entry before Europe is Turkey. Their lives are not threatened in Turkey. Why don't they just stay there?
Yes.
How would you respond to that?
The way we've responded and say Turkey has taken in 2.7 million Syrian refugees with very little help from the international community. UNHCR, my organization, and all of our partners are chronically underfunded. And this has been going on year after year. This has translated into many refugees really falling through the cracks, living in abject poverty, not being able to put their children in school. Their children are working instead of being in school. So is there any wonder why people say, actually, I need to move on? So what we're asking for is much more support to the countries like Turkey that are hosting so many refugees, and also then to share the burden. Don't say all the refugees have to be in the neighboring countries. That's not fair. You need to take some yourself. Cut off the smuggling route. Take them through legal avenues, increase this, tremendously, and this will go a long way to solving the problem.
The first bold attempt at solving the problem has been the Turkey-EU deal.
Yes.
It's been implemented for a little while. So far the numbers have dwindled a little bit. Amnesty International still calls it horse trading of human beings. What do you say to Amnesty?
Well, it was a very politicized deal, and it was done rather suddenly, and it did seem to be pushing the problem backwards. We were all for a managed handling of the refugee crisis, and unfortunately the EU was not able to do it. There was a good plan in place. There was a good EU plan to actually register, screen people coming to Greece, and then to distribute them across the EU. No, it wouldn't have been ever called a crisis if it had been done that way. But unfortunately, it came to this, and we're just hoping that in the end it will translate into the good parts of the deal. And the good parts of the deal are more support for the refugees residing in Turkey, more refugees getting on airplanes and being resettled to European and other countries, and renewed efforts to stop the war so that most of them just want to go home.
Talking about renewed efforts to stop the war, are you disappointed that some of the biggest hitters, I know Angela Merkel's here, but the likes of President Obama, John Kerry, Vladimir Putin, Sergei Lavrov, are you disappointed that none of them showed up here?
Yes, actually, because we're in the biggest humanitarian crisis of our time. And it's not just that the world is in crisis and people are suffering. The system to help them is suffering too. It needs to be revived, recharged, rethought. And so this is the opportunity and this is the moment, and it's really important. We still hope that we'll get a lot of momentum here, a lot of commitments here. The focus on the situation cannot go on as business as usual, I think is really critical, and hopefully with time this will be looked back on as the turning point after which the humanitarian system for addressing conflict really improved, and that there were renewed efforts to really address the drivers. Why are people suffering so much? The wars, the conflicts, the inequality, the poverty.
Now, there are all these efforts at mitigating the circumstances for refugees and migrants crossing from Turkey over the sort of Aegean route into the Balkans. That's happening, and then there's this flare-up from Libya across the Mediterranean to places like Lampedusa. Does it feel like a game of whack-a-mole sometimes in trying to solve these issues?
Yes, you maybe feel like you've solved it a little bit or pushed it into one direction and it pops up somewhere else, because of course we're dealing with human beings. And we always ask, particularly when it's people on the run, of course people who are fleeing a conflict are going to choose the route that they think is going to get them there. And unfortunately, their only chance really sometimes at having a decent life is to rely on criminal smugglers who exploit them, put their lives in danger again, and take them on whatever route is open.
Melissa, it's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Same to you.
It is a war that is now into its 5th year. What started out as an anti-government protest in 2011 in the south of Syria has now caused untold misery for millions of Syrians. Now, while the headlines that usually come out of Syria focus on military conflict, death tolls, and the inevitable peace talks, rarely mentioned are the children. Francis Collins has this report.
In Syria, violence has become part of everyday life. Very few have been untouched by the terror, and that includes children. There's a lost generation who've known nothing but the horrors of war. Over 3.5 million Syrian children have been born since the conflict began, over 300,000 as refugees. The only life they know is one that has been blighted by war. The danger of attack, the lack of teachers, and the destruction of facilities means that over 2 million children inside Syria and 700,000 in neighbouring countries are out of school and have been for years. And then there are the unlucky ones. In 2015 alone, there were more than 1,500 grave violations against children, killing and maiming as a result of explosive weapons. More than a third were killed while in school or while travelling to and from school. It's been getting worse year on year. In Syria's neighbouring countries, the number of refugees is nearly 10 times higher today than in 2012. Half of all the 4.8 million refugees outside the country are children. The dangers to children are not just on the war-torn streets of Syria, but on the perilous sea crossings as well. The children of Syria are the hidden victims of this war. Francis Collins, The Newsmakers.
I'm joined now by Justin Forsyth, UNICEF's Deputy Executive Director. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.
Justin. What are you doing to ensure that we do not see any more horrendous instances of 3-year-olds washing up on the beaches of the Aegean and other such horrific sites across the world?
Well, UNICEF, with lots of other UN agencies, but also non-government organisations with the Turkish government, is really working very, very hard to help refugees that have fled from Syria. And we're also working in some very tough situations in Syria itself with local groups, but also as UNICEF ourselves. And we do our bit. But the war is devastating the lives of millions of people. So many people have been displaced. We know millions of children are out of school. So we can't guarantee that. Unless we stop the war, we're going to continue to see these terrible scenes of children being killed or washed up on our shores, because there's no magic bullet to stop it unless you have peace in Syria. But what we'll do, and we'll continue to do with our frontline humanitarian workers at UNICEF, is do everything we can to save as many lives as possible.
Is Syria the worst place on earth to be a kid right now?
I think Syria is one of the worst places. Yemen is also pretty devastating at the moment, and South Sudan too. But Syria has to be right at the top of that list. And it's at the top of the list not just because children have been displaced by the war, but I've met children who have talked about how they've been deliberately targeted in this conflict, shot by snipers, schools attacked, hospitals attacked, and children have become targets in this war, which is a terrible indictment of those involved.
Tell me about a tangible initiative that's going to come out of here that's going to make a difference immediately.
Well, one of the most important announcements today is to provide a substantial amount of money for education. In the past, education has been like the poor relative of the humanitarian response. Less than 2% of humanitarian aid goes into education. But if you ask any child, nearly 90% of them will say education is the most important, even before food and water often, before shelter. And what we're going to get today is a big announcement to establish a new fund that will help maybe 13 million children around the world over the next 5 years keep learning, even in conflict, even in war. Because we know if they miss out on an education, you get a lost generation of children. It doesn't just shatter their lives, it has long-term consequences for our society. They become more vulnerable to extremists, they create instability in their community. So we have to invest in children in education right now.
How are we going to educate kids in conflict zones, given that even food convoys are struggling to reach kids in places like Daraya, for example, where infant formula is not getting through because of the various government blockages, because of the various political players? How are we going to educate them if they can't get food right now?
Well, we can do it. It's difficult, and there are big challenges. But even in Yarmouk, in the middle of the siege, many of the children carried on studying. They even went out to take their exams. They got 2 days to go out, and then they came back in. And we know, working with local Syrian organisations, even in some of those besieged areas, they've managed to keep informal education, not necessarily in schools. But as well as the money, we've also got to say to all the warring sides is don't occupy schools. Over 6,000 schools in Syria have been destroyed or occupied in this conflict. And it's not just in Syria, in other parts of the world this happens too. And one of the initiatives at this summit by Norway and Argentina is to have a safe schools declaration where all the warring sides don't occupy schools. They allow schools to be safe zones even in wars.
I mean, here I come in again with a cynical view. The Geneva Convention exists. Surely it has no ambiguity in terms of whether you should or shouldn't target schools. There are these laws of war that do exist. People are just not adhering to them.
Yeah.
How much can we guarantee that these multiple belligerents are not going to just sort of ignore these directives?
Well, I think that's a fair challenge, and I think that is a problem, and that's why the core to all of this is peace. I mean, what we're doing at the moment is sticking plasters on the wound. We're doing our best to make sure that there are rules in war, that we do protect schools, we do protect hospitals, and we do provide relief in these besieged areas. We're looking after millions and millions of children at the moment, but we know there's only really one solution to this: to stop children dying, to stop children suffering and being disabled, being raped, is actually to stop the war itself. And I think that's where an enormous amount of effort needs to go as well. But in the meantime, we can do better. We can get more aid in, we can keep children in school, and we can try and persuade people to allow schools to be safe spaces. And even in the middle of conflict, we've seen in other situations, children have been able to carry on learning.
Are you confident you have the political will backing you guys up to implement what you want, what you need to implement?
It's tough, and I don't think we have always seen the political will that's been necessary from leaders. A lot of leaders around the world are absorbed by domestic concerns, and this is a big challenge. But actually, I think one of the consequences of the refugee and migrant crisis, it's been a bit of a wake-up call to leaders across Europe and around the world. And I think this summit couldn't come at a more timely moment. So, you know, if we're going to we have to deal with the root causes of this conflict of getting peace, but we also need to provide more aid in Syria, not just in neighbouring countries. And we've also got to deal with these children on the move now right throughout Europe. And if we can come up with a plan that deals with the different parts, I think we have a chance of moving forward.
Final question for you. MSF were not keen on this summit for multiple reasons. They called it a fig leaf of good intentions. What would you say to MSF?
Well, I think MSF would be delighted to be proven wrong, and I think some of the announcements at this summit are concrete, like this education fund that could help 13 million children. But MSF are right to challenge all of us, right to challenge the global leaders in particular to step up to the mark and to make sure the outcomes of these summits aren't only promises, but are actually delivered on the ground.
Justin, thank you very much. Great pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
That's the end of our special edition of the Newsmakers from the World Humanitarian Summit here in Istanbul, where world leaders and NGOs are trying to find better ways to fund, manage and deliver aid. As the humanitarian chief, Stephen OBrien, told me, the world had a moral duty to provide concrete, practical steps to help those millions in need. We'll have more special coverage tomorrow. Until then, bye-bye.